This is an interview for the Industrial Relations Society of New South Wales Oral History Project. The interviewee is Jonathan Hamberger and I'm the interviewer Judy Hughes. The date is the 10th of December 2021. Welcome, Jonathan.
Hi.
Can we start with your early influences in life, where you're from and a bit about your family background?
Okay, well, I guess the important thing to know is that I'm English and I grew up in England and didn't come out to Australia till I was 21. And in terms of it, well, certainly I grew up effectively in the 70s. That was my formative decade. And if any, British politics and indeed industrial relations in the 70s were chaotic and extremely adversarial. And that actually, looking back, had a very big influence on my approach to industrial relations and I guess to politics and so on more generally. My father was a scientist and working for the government. He worked for the United Kingdom Atomic Energy Authority. And he actually had a bit of an influence on my attitudes to industrial relations as well, in the sense that he was actually a union delegate. Not that he wasn't terribly left-wing or generally particularly pro-union, but and he told me about, they actually went on strike at one stage, which was quite interesting because they were basically civil servants, scientific civil service. And he said it wasn't so much that they hadn't got a pay rise at the time, but it was that he was a scientist and the engineers had got a bigger pay rise than the scientists. And so it wasn't so much, and I thought that left me know that when people talk about fairness, it's a comparative concept. And so, you might accept what you've got, but if somebody else has got more than you and you can't see why they should, that creates a sense of grievance. And I always sort of sat in my mind. But really, I think the bigger influence was I became very interested in incomes policies. Britain, go back to the 70s, the big economic problem was sort of stagflation, high unemployment, high inflation, how to overcome that. And it seemed fairly clear that an incomes policy was the way to do it, or one way to do it anyway. And governments of both Labour and Conservative governments in Britain had tried and failed to have a successful incomes policy. And so that influenced my thinking. And it was very much about the need for people to work together and cooperate when it comes to industrial relations. And so I guess that's been kind of my driving, underlying, if you like, philosophy. And it was kind of partly influenced by seeing what happens. The way the British resolved it, if you like, was through Thatcherism, which was not really about cooperation, but nevertheless was a rather traumatic and not ideal way of resolving things. Though maybe it was the only way Britain could do it. But that certainly had an influence when I came to Australia, semi-consciously.
But you studied at university in England first.
Yeah, so I went to Oxford. I did a degree called Philosophy, Politics and Economics. You could do a unit in industrial relations, actually. And I thought, no, that sounds terribly boring. Why would I do it? I was much more interested in philosophy. Because I tend to think, well, industrial relations was all about strikes. And I wasn't terribly interested in strikes per se. And so, yeah, I didn't see why would you want to study at university, so I didn't. But when I came out to Australia, so I went straight into the workforce, basically, when I came out here, and joined the public service, and ended up went to work in the Prime Minister's department. They saw I had economics in my degree, though I hadn't actually done that much economics at Oxford, but they put me in the economic division, and I worked in wages policy. It wasn't through law, it was through economics and wages policy. And then that's really then I became fascinated by the Australian compulsory conciliation and arbitration system, as it then was, but also the opportunities for an incomes policy, which of course was quite a big issue at the time in Australia. And the Accord, which the Labour government that was elected in early 83 really had as its centrepiece. And so I was quite excited about that. And I actually think it worked pretty well, at least initially. It achieved what it was set out to achieve.
So, what year was that when you were with the Prime Minister's office?
So, well, the department. So, I mean, I came out in 1980. I actually started work in February, 2nd of February 1981. I still remember the date, in PM&C, and I was there for a couple of years, or just a bit less than a couple of years. So that was kind of the very end of the Fraser era, and then the beginning of the Hawke and then Hawke-Keating kind of era. And I actually I got really interested in industrial relations, worked in the sort of, there was a specialised industrial relations area in PM&C in those days. I ended up in that. And then I transferred across to the Department of Employment and Industrial Relations, as it then was, to work in the wages policy area, which was very much about the centralised wage fixing system and the Accord. And I worked there for a while. I kind of got a bit disillusioned with where the Accord was going, because I thought the centralised wage fixing system had achieved what it set out to achieve, but it kind of outlived its usefulness. And you began to realise, and there was much more discussion, so we're now talking about the mid-80s, there was a need to increase, the big issue was how to increase productivity, because while the Accord was pretty good at overcoming wage inflation and helping get unemployment under control and inflation at a sort of macro level, the issue then was people were getting more and more interested in all the problems that we had in Australia with productivity. And there was increasing sort of recognition that one reason why we had a productivity problem in Australia was actually our industrial relations system. And so there was increasing interest in moving to a decentralized, more on in getting at the workplace level. And there was sort of a debate about whether you could do that via a centralised wage fixing system. And there's not really time to go into the whole debate, but I sort of tended to the view that, well, no, actually we needed to move towards a more workplace focused system. And I kind of got a bit disillusioned and ended up, I suppose, not coincidentally therefore, going to work for the coalition, for the then Shadow Minister for Industrial Relations, who was Senator Fred Chaney, and worked for him, and then in fact for a while for Peter Reith. This is in opposition up until 1990, and really working on how to design a more decentralised wage fixing system, and then went to work for the New South Wales then Liberal government. This is the Greiner government, went there in 1990. It was involved, this is when state industrial relations systems still actually covered most people in Australia. And the New South Wales system was very important in a way that it's not as important now. It's still got a role, but it's much more limited. And we were at the forefront really of trying to introduce reform into the IR system, but at the state level in New South Wales, introducing in particular enterprise bargaining, voluntary unionism, and just generally more decentralised, flexible IR system. Then, and I didn't only work in industrial relations. I worked in various other areas of economic and social policy. But I then went to work when the Howard government was elected in '96. I went to work for the new Minister for Industrial Relations, Peter Reith. And this was all about, obviously, a major reform of the industrial relations system. And Labor had already embraced, to some extent, the idea of moving, well, they had embraced the idea of moving to enterprise bargaining, but it still was a bit of a messy system. And so, and arguably, anyway, the high point, or some people think the low point, but the high point of my career, I think, was working with Peter Reith on the '96 Workplace Relations Act. And that was kind of my thing, and that was what I did with him. I had a very big hand in that legislation, not only kind of writing it, but also getting it through Parliament, which was not easy because the government didn't control the Senate. We had to negotiate the legislation through a fairly hostile upper house, which was a very interesting experience, but one that actually worked quite well in the end. We ended up, I thought, with a better piece of legislation after the negotiation process, which was mainly with the Australian Democrats at the time, and that we actually started with. So, so that was kind of the most challenging and difficult period of my whole career, I would say. Oh, yeah, that was that when it was only for a year, but that was kind of so March '96 to March '97. That was for me.
So were you part of that decision to change the title of the Act?
Yeah, funnily enough, not. No. I've been thinking about this just this morning. I was thinking about, because I mean, there's a bit of an issue about the term industrial relations, and we're still the Industrial Relations Society in New South Wales. And I kind of quite like that name and don't really see, the trouble is that, and no, I mean, I don't actually know whose idea it was to call it the Workplace Relations Act, but it wasn't mine. And I don't think anybody even asked my opinion on it, actually. I wasn't really interested in that kind of stuff. And I would have been quite happy to have not changed the name, because it was the Industrial Relations Act prior to that. And I would have been quite happy to keep with the Industrial Relations Act. I mean, I can go into that, why I think there are problems with the term workplace relations. There are problems with, we could change our name in New South Wales to, as some of the other, it has happened at the national level, to the Labour and Employment Relations Association, but I don't particularly want to do that. I don't feel strongly about it, but I think IR is still as good a name as anything, but there is some baggage associated with it in some people's minds. But no, I actually wasn't part of the show. That was one thing I didn't have much to do. I had a pretty big hand in the legislation, but the name actually is not something I had any involvement with.
What were the key things that you were involved in creating that act?
Well, pretty much everything else. So it was really reform to the whole role of arbitration, the role of the Commission, really complete reform of enterprise bargaining, the rules around industrial action, the introduction of Australian workplace agreements, and freedom of association, in particular the right not to join a union if you don't want to. It was a pretty comprehensive reform of the system, so there were a whole load of changes. But I was pretty much involved in all those, just not the name. There were one or two other areas I wasn't. I was pretty much involved in virtually everything that was in that legislation, which was, so it was a much more, greatest focus on individual rights, and also further progressing something that Labor had already started, which was moving towards a more decentralised system with a smaller role for awards and the compulsory arbitration system. We didn't completely abolish compulsory arbitration, but what we did do was wind back its purview, the ambit of compulsory arbitration, the capacity of the Commission to arbitrate any kind of industrial dispute. We restricted that very deliberately.
Because?
Oh, well, that's a very big issue, because the basic principle was we wanted people to resolve their issues at the workplace level. I mean, that's the fundamental idea, and the argument was that if the Commission could arbitrate on virtually everything, that there was always a temptation to let the Commission arbitrate disputes and issues, rather than resolving it at the workplace level. I mean, it's a whole big debate about that. In fact, the person, the academic who really pushed this in Australia, the need to do that, was really John Nyland, actually, many years earlier, actually. But that was the direction we took it, and it's really, even though obviously it had a lot of criticism at the time, actually when Labor were re-elected, the Fair Work Act, which replaced the workplace relations legislation, did not change that in any fundamental way. The basic principle remained that there were limited scope for the Commission to arbitrate, and in fact, in some respect, well, there was work choices in between, but that wasn't in place for all that long. But what I'm saying is, Labor didn't really make any great changes on that basic principle in the end, even though, of course, at the time they made a hell of a fuss about it.
So after the Act came in, were you involved in the implementation of it as well?
Well, yes. I left Peter Reith's office just before the huge waterfront dispute blew up, and I could see it. I could see it coming. Like we knew. And I did a bit of thinking about the waterfront, but we knew it was going to happen. And I thought, I don't think I could cope with this. Even though I work in industrial relations and a lot of my work is about conflict, I can only cope with a certain level of conflict, and I knew that was going to be an absolute shit fight. So I kind of was quite happy to get out before that, that really happened. And I went to work for the Office of the Employment Advocate, which was one of the bodies that was set up under the new legislation, which had the advantage that its head office was in Sydney, and I lived in Sydney. So that was rather good. And I went there as the deputy and had quite a role in helping establish that office, which had various functions under the Workplace Relations Act, but was certainly involved in implementing some of the bigger changes, not all of them by any means, but some of the bigger changes, obviously the introduction of Australian workplace agreements, and also freedom of association and various other aspects of the legislation. And then after a couple of years, the guy who was the head of it, the employment advocate, Adam Rowe, moved to another job, and they made me, the government appointed me as the employment advocate. And so I was in that role until, in fact, I was appointed to the Industrial Relations Commission in 2004. And so I was, yes, very much involved in implementing aspects of the legislation at the OEA and as the employment advocate. And then, in fact, in a way, even at the commission, I suppose when I did go there, we were still essentially implementing the Workplace Relations Act until, work choices came in, which stuffed it up a bit.
When you were the employment advocate, that was quite a public role. How was that?
Yeah, it was a very public role, and it was very, I didn't really enjoy the public side. I accepted I had to do it. So I did a lot of media. I had to appear in Senate estimates. I did a lot of public speaking. I found that very stressful, to be honest. But I did it because you had to do it. It was part of the job. But I found that a pretty, and it was a very contentious role. It was very controversial. So you were always getting attacked. Basically, which I kind of, the commission's a much more, respectful organisation. People are much less likely to get stuck into you at the commission. They're usually more polite. They weren't very polite to me at when I was employment advocate. I had various people call me all sorts of horrible names, which, you knew they were just doing it. It was just politics, but it wasn't, you shouldn't take it personally, but, you did. Well, I did. Consciously I didn't, but in practice I did. And so I was quite happy to go to the commission where everyone was so much nicer to you.
What do you think you achieved as employment advocate? What did you set out to achieve?
Well, because in a way it's hard to know because AWAs don't exist, and that was our biggest area of work. And of course they don't exist anymore as such. Though, mind you, we now have individual flexibility arrangements, which are really in some ways nearly as flexible as AWAs and are kind of quite uncontentious. So I think, though, we did help entrench the notion of greater flexibility. And so I think I did play quite a role in helping create a more flexible system where employers and employees were more able to resolve their own problems at the workplace level. There's been a bit of slippage in the system in recent years where I think we're moving back towards a more highly regulated system, which I think, isn't necessarily a great thing. And that's not necessarily having a go at either side of politics. I think there's been all sorts, it's been both sides have done that. And I think mistakenly, but nevertheless, we haven't gone back. I think I did play quite a significant role it certainly was very, very interesting role where I got to see a lot of what happens at the workplace level, more than I did at the commission, to be honest. I used to spend a lot of time going out and visiting workplaces as employment advocate and seeing this, and help, working with people to see what changes they could make and seeing what people could do to be more flexible and realizing some of the unintended consequences of the regulations that the IR system imposes. And AWAs provided quite a good, not a perfect, but quite a good way of overcoming some of those unnecessary restrictions in a way that really did, in my view, generally, well, perhaps in every case, benefit both business and employees. Because I'm at least as concerned for helping employees as I am for employers, even though I think some people think I might be more one side than the other. I don't.
How was that transition to the Commission, given your role as employment advocate was a bit controversial? Did you think you would be judged by your background?
Yeah, well, when I was first appointed, or when my appointment was first announced, there was the usual kind of name calling, and I got called various names, and people said how outrageous it was that I'd been appointed. So, oh God, what's this going to be like? But actually, from the day I started, I found all that was history. In fact, that everyone treated you with respect. The unions, I think, I certainly had quite a lot of union people say to me over the next couple of years or so, oh, we thought we didn't realise how balanced you would be, and we thought you'd be really awful, but actually we find you're absolutely fine. So I think, but no, it was funny. There's a thing about the thing about the commission is, and I don't think this has changed that much. In its various guises, Fair Work Australia, Fair Work Commission. I don't think, there is that once people are appointed to it, almost everybody acts impartially, or tries to act impartially. I certainly did. And most people respect that and recognise that. And that's the great strength of the Commission, one of its many strengths. So, yeah, but it was quite nice not being called names all the time. And being treated with a bit more respect. I must say, I enjoyed that. I mean, I did like that. That was important to me, because I didn't really enjoy I'm not a politician, I decided, I was always very interested in politics, but I decided at a relatively young age I didn't have a thick enough skin to go into politics. And even the employment advocate, well, it wasn't a political role as such, you did cop a lot, and I didn't enjoy that. And it didn't happen. It doesn't happen very much at all once you're on the commission. People are much nicer to you, which is good, thank God.
In terms of the society, when did you join?
Well, I mean, I did join the society when I very first got involved in industrial relations way back in 1980, what was talking about, 82, I suppose it would have been, 81, 82. So I was in it in Canberra. This is in the ACT. I actually then my membership lapsed, basically. And when I moved to Sydney, which was in 1990, I didn't join. I didn't join the New South Wales Society, I don't think. I certainly wasn't active in it. And for various reasons, I wasn't involved really in the society until a little bit after I went to the commission, and I sort of started going to events again, and then I think actually I replaced Greg Harrison, who I think you've interviewed. When he came off the committee, I went on it because I thought there should be somebody from the commission on the committee, and then gradually, so I can't even remember what year that was, but it was a good few years ago now. And then I became vice president for a while, and then obviously I've been president for the last couple of years. So yeah, so I sort of had this period right at the beginning of my career where I was a member of the IR Society and found it a very useful way of, especially I was in PM&C, so I didn't have a lot of people who were interested in industrial relations who I worked with. So it was a great opportunity to network with people who were interested in industrial relations. And then later in my career, I suppose, after I got appointed to the Commission, I got more and more involved in the New South Wales IR Society.
What do you see as the key strengths of the society?
Well, I mean, the most important thing about the society is that it brings people together from all the different aspects of industrial relations. So you've got people from the tribunals, you've got people from academia, you've got employer people, both people from within companies or particular organisations, but also employer associations. You've got lawyers, you've got unions. So that's really important because there are already other bodies that deal with industrial relations, but so the lawyers have their own association. There's the Australian Labour Law Association that covers sort of on one level the same stuff we do. There's the unions have their own kind of outfit that brings all the union people together. Academics have AIRANS, which brings all the academics interested in industrial relations together. So there are all these and HR people have ARI. So there are lots of other bodies that deal with kind of what I will continue to call industrial relations issues, workplace relations issues, employment relations issues, whatever you want to call them. But they're all focused on particular, relatively narrow interests. So your union, academic, employer, whatever. Whereas we in the IR Society bring all those people together, which is very important, I believe, and that's really our value add, if you like. And so if all we're doing, we don't just do what the others do, because what we do is bring people together. And so I'm really keen, and particularly my role on the side, I've been really keen to make sure that we kind of leverage off that and focus on, as a key. So it means making sure that our membership really is balanced, that we do have members from all those different groups that are involved in industrial relations, and also that as far as possible, we kind of use the fact, have a debate, have a discussion, so that we, get the value that there are people coming from a union perspective. So often we'll have events, and I'll try and make sure that we have people from different perspectives talking about the same topic, but bringing their particular perspectives in. And that's really great. I think that's where we really add value. And that's why I really want I really want the IR Society to continue to be, because you could still have people doing, the law, lawyers could be updated on the latest developments in legislation or case law through the Labour Law Association. Union people will get their updates, RE deal with their stuff. Academics have their own institution, but we bring them all together, we do. I mean, I'd say we should, but we actually do that. I mean, there's always room to do it better, but we do that. And that's really the critical benefit of the IR Society that nobody else has. There is no other equivalent body.
With 2 years of a pandemic, there's emerging workplace issues.
Yeah.
Is that very important?
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously we've had to move a lot of our events online. But that's been a kind of both so we at first we were like everybody else, we were stunned when the pandemic started. We just cancelled everything, which was terrible, which was, oh my God, what are we going to do? And then of course when we started realizing, there's this thing called Zoom, and you can actually do things online. And so we started running a lot of functions over Zoom, and so we ran a series of webinars, and we still do that. And we probably may always do that, to be honest, even when we can do things face to face. And we actually found that even though there's a lot to be said for doing things face to face, there are some advantages. But we had much bigger audiences. We'd have more, because we could have people from all around Australia coming to our webinars, and we actually would have a higher number of people participating when we were doing things online. And also, and so in terms of issues, a lot of the sessions have been about issues to do with the pandemic, obviously compulsory vaccination, the health and safety implications of COVID. I mean, a lot, the impact of COVID on different groups in the workforce. It's been it's been a hot topic, obviously, and it's had a huge impact on the workplace. It's the single biggest thing that's had an impact on the workplace for, I don't know how long, a long time. And we've been right at the forefront of keeping on top of that and keeping our members up to date with what the latest case law is, what the latest trends are, and so on. Yeah, so that's been a really big thing for us, obviously. Both initially an incredibly negative thing, because we thought, obviously some of our networking functions have been knocked back. I mean, we were able to run a conference, very successful conference face-to-face this year. But realistically, we've not been able to run as many face-to-face events by any means. So some of that networking's been lost. It's pretty hard to network over Zoom, really, I think. But we've had plenty of events, and a lot of them, of course, not all of them, but a lot of them have focused on issues that have arisen from either directly or indirectly from the pandemic.
And what do you think the future of the society is?
Well, I hope that we will continue to emphasize the bringing together of all these different groups. I think that I think people thought industrial relations is a bit of a dinosaur. It's just dying. I think that's absolute rubbish. I think people thought of IR as being, well, that's all about unions and collectivism and sort of strikes. What I was saying I wasn't interested in when I was back at university. So it was all about collectivism, and those things have definitely declined for good or ill, whatever. The world's changed. Fewer people are in unions. We don't have as many collective disputes in the Commission. We don't have as many strikes, fortunately. But doesn't mean that issues at work aren't as important now. Like, if you think of it in a broader sense of how do people relate to each other at work, and how is that regulated and managed at a societal and a workplace level, that's as big an issue today as it ever was, and probably until we're all replaced by robots, which I don't think is going to happen in my lifetime anyway. I think the IR Society, even if we change its name, though there's no particular pushed to do that. But the society will continue to have an important role. I mean, the issues have changed a bit, but we've kept up with it. So issues like bullying, issues like sexual harassment. I mean, you think of some of the big issues that are, if like front page stories still, there may not be strikes so much, but issues about sexual harassment, issues about workplace misconduct more generally, issues like whether you can require people to be vaccinated against COVID. These are big stories of general interest to people, and obviously very important at the workplace level. And these are the issues that we cover. These are the issues that we have the experts come and talk to our members, and then we have discussions about those precise topics. And I want us to continue to be at the leading edge of discussion on how best to deal with these things. So I think we've got a very good future if we choose to grasp it, if you like. Well, I don't see why we shouldn't. I mean, I do think we've rebuilt our membership quite a bit in recent years. It did, for various reasons, dwindle away. But I mean, one of the problems is that IR is not, the universities don't tend to produce industrial relations graduates so much. If you go to companies, not that many companies now have an industrial relations department. So it's tempting to think, well, industrial relations isn't so significant anymore. But if you take a broader view, which is what I've been talking about, then I think it's just as big as ever. In fact, there may be more people involved in industrial relations seen in that broader sense today than there would have been 10 years ago. One of the interesting challenges, I've got to be careful how I put this, but is that because the system's become more and more legalistic, which I have to say I don't think is a good thing, the society, almost as a corollary, has tended to become more and more dominated by lawyers. Now, I love my legal friends, and lawyers have an extremely important role to play in the society. But it's not all about lawyers and the law. And it's really important that we continue to have members and run functions that are relevant to human resource, people working in human resources who are dealing with workplace issues, people working in unions, employer associations. Not every issue is a legal issue. And so, and the trouble is that there are issues like sexual harassment, for example, that you can look at through a legal lens, but that's not necessarily the best lens to look at it. And if you're too focused on the legal issues, you miss what might be the most important stuff about workplace culture and about a whole lot of other, and about management and stuff like that. And so it's very important that the society keeps that broader perspective and we don't just become for lawyers. And because, as I said, there is already a labour law association, a very good association. If all we're doing is being a kind of another labour law association, there's no point in us continuing to exist. So yeah, that's a bit of a challenge though, because there is a bit of a risk that because there's so much focus on legislation and case law and the law in this area, and in increasing, it's got worse, if I can put it that way, or better, it's got more so. There's a risk that the IR study will kind of just purely be dragged down that direction, which I think would be a shame. And I've worked quite hard to try and avoid that happening, with some success.
I think we're just about out of time. Is there anything we haven't covered that you want to say?
No, I think I've covered the key things. I mean, there's obviously issues about the future of industrial relations beyond the society, but I guess I've sort of hinted at that. I mean, I think that I do have this. I am worried about the increasing legalisation of, or the technical term is juridification of employment relations, if you like, or industrial relations, where there's more and more, where we try and resolve problems at the workplace level more and more by passing more laws. And while I haven't got time to go into it, I think that may well not produce optimal outcomes, if I could put it politely. I think that's going to be an ongoing challenge for this area, from a policy perspective, I guess, as much as anything else. So do we allow ourselves to continually pass more and more legislation and more rules? I think that would be a mistake. I think we have to find better ways of dealing with issues. Or maybe we need more flexible rules. We need rules, we need standards. Definitely, I don't have a problem with I'm not against there being law and rules in this area, but they need to be more flexible and less prescriptive if they're to be effective. that's kind of my personal philosophy at the moment.
All right then, I think that's about it.
Okay, great. Okay. Thank you. Thanks.